Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. In this video, we're going to be discussing the question, is Mrs. Norris a Maledictus? We know Mrs. Norris as the loyal feline companion of Argus Filch, Hogwarts caretaker and resident squib. Filch first assumed the role of caretaker in 1968, succeeding Apollyon Pringle, and has been roaming the halls of Hogwarts ever since. Along with his trusty feline companion, Mrs. Norris, Filch is always on the lookout for students breaking the rules. Filch is quite a misunderstood character, and he's really glossed over in the films. I'm not sure that it's even addressed that he's a squib. The films paint him in quite a negative light, almost as if he is evil. But in reality, Filch is just bitter. He was born a non-magical man into a magical world, which I expect would be exceptionally difficult. And though he doesn't hate the students, he does love to give them a hard time, which I suppose we can just let him have. But if there's one thing that's for certain, Filch loves his feline companion, Mrs. Norris, who is the subject of this video. Mrs. Norris is a female cat with dust-colored fur and piercing yellow eyes. As is common with the film adaptations, Mrs. Norris's appearance is inconsistent with the book. In the early films, she was shown to have red eyes, and in the later films, she had blue eyes. Additionally, the films portrayed her as having brown and grey fur. Mrs. Norris's name comes from a character in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, and was borrowed for the Harry Potter series by Rowling. There are actually some parallels between the two Mrs. Norris as well, as the Mrs. Norris from Mansfield Park is judgmental, disagreeable, and villainish to an extent. I'm sure the students of Hogwarts look at Mrs. Norris in a similar light. One thing that's worth asking, though, is why would Filch name his cat Mrs. Norris? Is he a Jane Austen fan? Fans think that this could perhaps be a subtle hint at a relationship between him and Hogwarts librarian Madame Pince, who I'm sure would be familiar with the works of Austen. Madame Pince, like Filch, was not popular with the student body either, and well, the two would be perfect together. Back to Filch and Norris. The two are never apart, except for when they've temporarily decided to scout out different areas of the school. They seem to have an almost quasi-telepathic connection, as they are able to communicate in spite of the fact that they are just, well, squib and cat. When Mrs. Norris encounters students misbehaving, Filch seems to show up right away, and vice versa. So what could the explanation be for their complicated relationship? And how do they achieve near human levels of interaction? One theory for this is that Mrs. Norris is a Maledictus. If Maledictus sounds familiar, then you're probably thinking of Nagini, Voldemort's trusty sidekick, who also happens to be a confirmed Maledictus. The term Maledictus refers to any woman, they are always women, suffering from a blood curse that causes them to eventually and permanently transform into a beast. The curse persists for generations and is passed down from one generation to the next, from mother to daughter. Before permanently transforming, which inevitably happens to all of them, they have control over their transformations, and can transform back and forth between their human and animal forms, much like an animagus. However, eventually they lose this control, and are stuck in their animal form forever. In Fantastic Beasts, Nagini is still shown in the earlier stages of her gradual transformation, and seems to be able to switch between the two forms relatively easily. So, why do we think that Mrs. Norris might be a Maledictus? First off, she's incredibly intelligent. And yes, cats are intelligent, but not to the extent that Mrs. Norris showcases in the books and films. One argument for this is that Mrs. Norris is part Kneazle. Kneazles are magical creatures that resemble cats, have a very high level of intelligence, and are said to even have an uncanny ability to detect suspicious and distrustful people. This would be a perfect explanation for Mrs. Norris being the way that she is, if J.K. Rowling hadn't already entirely refuted that claim. Given that the option of her being a Kneazle is off the table entirely, the prospect of her being a Maledictus is looking more and more likely. Next, Mrs. Norris seems to be unusually old for a house cat. Though we don't know her exact age, she's got to be well above average life expectancy. After all, in Chapter 10 of The Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry sees our very own Mrs. Norris on the Marauders map. The Marauders attend Hogwarts from 1971 to 1978, and if Mrs. Norris was notable enough to be included on their map, it's likely that she would have been giving them trouble for at least a few years. For this reason, I would expect that the marauders dealt with Mrs. Norris during the first couple of years that they attended the school. If this is the case, even if Mrs. Norris was born the same exact year that they started, she would still be 27 years old by the time the Battle of Hogwarts occurred in 1998, which we know that she participated in. She was seen hissing, screeching, and batting at owls during the battle, which is rather sprightly behavior for such an old cat. Furthermore, this is a far reach from the life expectancy of an average house cat, and this is all assuming that she was born the exact year that they started, when in reality it was probably before then. In fact, Filch started at the school in '68, and I'm willing to bet that she started alongside him. In my opinion, this supports the claim that Mrs. Norris is a maledictus, as a maledictus's form is said to not be limited by the lifespan of the animal that they transform into. Bearing all of this in mind, there's just no way that Mrs. Norris is a regular house cat. If she isn't part Kneazle, then there has got to be some sort of other explanation. I was honestly a bit surprised when Rowling announced that Mrs. Norris isn't a Kneazle, as it would provide us with such a clear answer that would address all of the above points. I would even argue that Mrs. Norris has exhibited intelligence beyond that of a Kneazle, but I'm not sure that I know enough about Kneazles to so boldly make that claim. If we look at the facts, Mrs. Norris is incredibly intelligent, and seems to exhibit the behavior of a very young cat at an age that is far out of reach, except in very few circumstances, for the average house cat. Various studies have stated that the median age for a house cat is 14, which is nearly half what Mrs. Norris would have been during the Battle of Hogwarts. I don't see how you could reasonably claim this is just a regular cat, unless the duration of her life was somehow extended through magic.
If we look at the relationship between Voldemort and Nagini, it's very similar to the relationship between Filch and Mrs. Norris. When Nagini first discovered Voldemort, she was just a lost maledictus, devoid of communication. And when she finally found him, she leaped at the opportunity to be with someone who could finally understand her, someone who she could finally tell her story to. Furthermore, while Nagini was maybe not so similar to Voldemort initially, she developed over time and became more and more like her human companion, something that I can totally imagine happening with Mrs. Norris and Filch, who are so seemingly alike. One issue with this comparison, however, is that Voldemort can speak Parseltongue, meaning that he's able to communicate with snakes, and Filch is just a squib. Can squibs speak cat? In 1992, when Mrs. Norris was petrified by Salazar Slytherin's basilisk, Filch first blamed Harry Potter, who was spotted right at the scene of the crime. Filch is visibly more upset than we've ever seen him before and says, in front of everyone, "You killed my cat! I'll kill you! I'll kill you!" While Filch is bitter and a bit hard to deal with sometimes, he's not usually so violent in nature. And this passion that he's exhibiting, to me, suggests that perhaps he knows Mrs. Norris on a deeper level. Perhaps he knows something about her that the rest of us don't. If Mrs. Norris is a maledictus, then we can only assume that Filch knows her on a much deeper level than anyone else, and this would explain their bond. It would also explain, partly, why Filch is as bitter as he is, having lost someone that he truly cared for, in part due to a blood curse. But who could she be? A former love interest? A relative? Who knows? Losing a loved one to magic and being born a squib, I can see why he is the way that he is. Compelling argument, right? Here's where it gets less interesting. There have been long circulating rumors that Mrs. Norris is an unregistered animagus, and in an interview in 2005, Rowling responded to the rumors with the following: "No, she's just an intelligent and unpleasant cat." If you're anything like me, then you're probably going to be dissatisfied with this answer. If Mrs. Norris is just an intelligent cat, how does she have a quasi-telepathic relationship with Filch? How is she bouncing off the walls, hissing and swatting at owls at 27 years of age? It just doesn't add up. And I'd like to see a new answer out of Rowling, particularly as it's been quite a bit of time since her old response, and the term maledictus was rarely discussed until more recent years. Rowling has a bit of a history of saying things that she doesn't necessarily mean, as well as things that don't necessarily make sense, so I'm interested to see if she ends up revising her original statement. What do you guys think? Are you also unconvinced that Mrs. Norris is just a regular house cat? How old do you think she actually is? Let me know in the comment section below. Until next time.
You're a wizard, Harry!